My name is Angela, and I'm 31 years old now, looking at an old camping photo with my mother from when I was 16. Back then, I thought that trip was going to be a special mother-daughter bonding experience in the Colorado mountains. What actually happened changed everything I believed about trust family and the person who was supposed to protect me above all else. Before I tell you how I survived 5 days alone in the mountains, let me know where you're watching from. If you've ever been betrayed by someone you trusted completely, please like and subscribe. At 16, I was an honor roll student at Boulder High School in Colorado. My life revolved around advanced placement classes, debate team, and planning for college applications. It had been just my mother, Jennifer, and me since I was 10 when my father died in a car accident on his way home from a business trip. That tragedy had brought us closer than most mothers and daughters could ever be. My mother was 44, then a successful marketing executive at a tech startup downtown. She had this incredible ability to balance her demanding career with being a devoted single parent. Despite the long hours and pressure at work, she never missed a school event, never forgot to ask about my day, never made me feel like I was anything less than her absolute priority. We had our sacred traditions that kept us connected. Friday nights were for movies where we'd order Thai food and watch everything from classic films to terrible reality shows, laughing until our stomachs hurt. Saturday mornings meant the farmers market on Pearl Street, where we'd buy fresh flowers and sample pastries, planning our week ahead. Sundays were for hiking, exploring the countless trails around Boulder, talking about everything and nothing as we climbed. What struck everyone who knew us was how my mother had never really dated after Dad died. There had been a few coffee dates here and there, men from her office or guys she met at the gym, but nothing ever progressed past a second meeting. She would always say the same thing when I asked about it. "You're my priority, Angela. When you're off to college, maybe I'll think about dating, but right now it's just us two against the world." I believed her. I wore that dedication like armor when classmates talked about their intact families, when they complained about step-parents or their parents' new relationships. I had something special, something pure. A mother who chose me above everything else. Everything started to shift in January of that year when Mum went to a corporate retreat in Aspen. The company did these quarterly team-building events, usually involving some kind of outdoor activity since we lived in Colorado. This time it was winter survival training led by an outside consultant named Brian, who owned a company called Iron Will Adventures. Mum came back from that weekend different. Not dramatically, but in small ways I started noticing over the following weeks. She talked about Brian constantly quoting his philosophies about modern life, making people soft, about the importance of being prepared for anything, about how comfort was killing the human spirit. Brian was 48, she told me, describing him with an enthusiasm I'd never heard when she talked about anyone before. He was ex-military special forces, though he never talked about his service directly. After leaving the army, he'd started his survival training company, working with corporate groups and wealthy families who wanted to teach their children resilience. He had salt and pepper hair that he wore longer than military regulation arms that looked carved from granite, and eyes that Mum described as seeing right through to your soul. The first time I met Brian was 3 weeks after the retreat. Mum invited him for dinner, claiming it was to discuss potentially hiring his company for more corporate events. But I knew something else was happening the moment he walked through our door. He brought me an expensive hunting knife as a gift, presenting it with ceremony, like he was bestowing some great honor. Every young woman should know how to protect herself. He said, his handshake deliberately firm, testing my grip. "I see you have your mother's eyes, but do you have her spirit?" The question made me uncomfortable, like I was being evaluated for something I didn't understand. Throughout dinner, Brian dominated the conversation with stories about his training programs, about the transformations he'd witnessed when people were pushed beyond their comfort zones. He kept using phrases like stripping away the unnecessary and finding your true self through adversity. Mum hung on every word, and I watched her transform in his presence. She laughed differently, louder and longer at his jokes. She agreed with everything he said, even when it contradicted things she'd told me before. When he mentioned that modern teenagers were the weakest generation in human history, she nodded enthusiastically, though just a week earlier, she'd been praising my generation's activism and awareness. After that dinner, Brian became a constant presence in our lives. He would show up for breakfast before work, bringing green smoothies that tasted like grass, because processed food is poison for the mind. He convinced Mum to join a CrossFit gym, and suddenly our Saturday farmers market trips were replaced with her workout sessions. She started buying books with titles like Primitive Skills for Modern Times and The Warrior's Path to Mental Strength. The changes accelerated through February and March. Mum traded her business wardrobe for tactical pants and moisture-wicking shirts. She stopped wearing makeup because Brian said natural beauty didn't need enhancement. She started criticizing my lifestyle choices, things she'd never cared about before. Why did I need to study so much? Book learning wouldn't help in a real crisis. Why was I so attached to my phone? Technology was making me dependent and weak. The argument started small but grew intense. One night, after I'd spent the evening studying for an AP chemistry exam, instead of joining them for wilderness skills training in the backyard, Brian looked at Mum and said, "You've sheltered her too much, Jen. She's not prepared for the real world." "I'm 16, I shot back. "The real world for me is getting into a good college." Brian smiled in that condescending way that made my skin crawl. "And what happens when the power grid fails? When society collapses? Will your chemistry textbook save you?" Mum, who had always valued education above everything, who had saved every dollar to fund my college dreams, just nodded. "He has a point, Angela. We've made you too comfortable." 2 weeks before my spring break, Mum announced the camping trip while I was doing homework at the kitchen table. She stood in the doorway with an expression I couldn't read, somewhere between excitement and something darker. "I've planned something special for your birthday this year," she said. My birthday was in April, still a month away. A mother-daughter camping trip, just the two of us, like we used to do with Dad. This was a lie. We'd never been camping with Dad. He'd hated the outdoors, preferred hotels to tents. But I didn't correct her. "That sounds fun," I said carefully. "Where are we going? It's a surprise." "But Angela, this is important. Really important. This trip will change everything for you. You're going to come back stronger, more capable, more prepared for life." The way she said it made my stomach clench. "Is Brian coming?" She shook her head quickly, too quickly. "No, he has a corporate group that week. This is just for us, our time." We went shopping for gear the next day, but Mum was strange about it. She insisted on minimal supplies, saying we needed an authentic experience. When I reached for a high-tech sleeping bag, she stopped me. "We'll share one. It builds trust and conserves heat." When I wanted to buy extra food, she said we'd only need enough for 3 days. "But aren't we going for 5 days?" I asked. She didn't answer directly. "We'll figure it out as we go. That's part of the adventure." The night before we left, Mum came into my room while I was packing. She sat on my bed watching me fold clothes with an intensity that made me nervous. Then she pulled me into a crushing hug, holding on so long I started to squirm. "You know I love you more than anything in this world, right?" she said into my hair. "Of course, Mum. I love you too. You're stronger than you know, Angela. Remember that. Whatever happens, you're stronger than you know." She pulled back and handed me an envelope sealed with wax like something from another century. "Only open this in an emergency," she said. "Promise me." "Mum, you're scaring me. What's going on?" She forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Nothing, sweetie. I'm just emotional. My baby is growing up. After this trip, you won't be my little girl anymore." The morning of our departure came with a sense of foreboding I couldn't shake. Mum woke me at 4 in the morning, 2 hours earlier than we'd planned. She was already dressed and packed, moving through the house with nervous energy, checking and rechecking supplies I wasn't allowed to see. "Brian's not coming to see us off?" I asked, noting his absence with relief. "He had an early client," Mum said, but her eyes darted away when she said it. "He wishes us luck, though, said this will be the making of you." We loaded her SUV in the dark, and I noticed she'd removed the GPS unit from the dashboard. "For a more authentic experience," she explained when I asked. "We don't need technology telling us where to go." The 3-hour drive into the Rocky Mountain wilderness started in complete silence. Mum gripped the steering wheel so tight her knuckles went white, and she kept checking the rearview mirror like someone was following us. As Boulder disappeared behind us and the mountains loomed larger, she finally started talking, but it was stream of consciousness jumping from topic to topic without logic. She talked about meeting my father, their wedding, his death. But the stories were different from ones I'd heard before. She made him sound weak, dependent, unable to handle real challenges. "Not like Brian," she kept saying. "Brian knows what real strength looks like." We stopped at a small town called Nederland to get gas and final supplies. Mum bought things that seemed odd for a casual camping trip. A whistle waterproof matches water purification tablets, an emergency blanket, a small hatchet. When I questioned the purchases, she snapped at me for the first time. "Stop questioning everything, Angela. I know what I'm doing. Brian taught me what we really need out there." Back in the car, she pulled out a hand-drawn map instead of using her phone. Brian had marked the location himself, she explained. A special spot he'd found years ago, completely isolated, where we could have a real wilderness experience without tourists and marked trails ruining everything. We turned off the main highway onto a Forest Service road, then onto increasingly rough dirt tracks. The SUV bounced over rocks and through shallow creek beds. My phone lost signal after the first hour on dirt roads, the no service message, a constant reminder of our isolation. Mum started teaching me things as we drove, insisting I pay attention and repeat everything back. How to find north without a compass, how to identify animal tracks, what plants were edible, how to build a debris shelter. It felt like cramming for a test I didn't know I was taking. We stopped once more at an official ranger station, and I assumed Mum would register our camping trip. She went inside while I stretched my legs, but came back too quickly. "Did you tell them where we're going?" I asked. "They were busy," she said. "Besides, Brian says the best experiences happen when no one knows where you are." Real freedom. Another hour of driving on paths that barely qualified as roads brought us to our destination. Mum stopped the SUV in a small clearing surrounded by towering pines with mountains rising on all sides. The beauty was breathtaking, but the isolation was complete. No trails, no signs, no indication that humans had ever been here. "This is perfect," Mum said, but her voice cracked. We unloaded our minimal gear, and that's when Mum's behaviour became almost manic. She insisted on teaching me every survival skill immediately, like we were running out of time. First came the tent, and she made me set it up alone 3 times until I could do it in under 10 minutes. "The stakes go in at 45-degree angles, always facing away from the tent," she said. "The rainfly has to be drum tight or water will pool and collapse everything. This could save your life, Angela. Are you listening, Mum? I've got it. Why are you being so intense?" She ignored me, moving on to fire building. She made me gather kindling, showing me how to identify dry wood even after rain, how to build different types of fires for different purposes. A teepee for quick heat, a log cabin for long burning, a Dakota fire hole for concealment. She had me practice with matches, then with flint and steel, then attempting friction with sticks, though I never got that last method to work. "Water is your first priority always," she said, leading me to a small stream about 100 yards from camp. She showed me how to identify safe water sources, how to use the purification tablets, how to boil water for safety. You can survive 3 weeks without food, but only 3 days without water. Remember that, Angela. 3 days. The intensity in her eyes when she said 3 days made my stomach drop. She pulled out a book about edible plants pointing to various species around our campsite. "These berries are safe when they're dark purple, never when they're red. Pine needle tea has vitamin C. This inner bark is edible if you're desperate. Never eat mushrooms unless you're 100% certain. When in doubt, don't." "Mum, stop. We have enough food. Why are you teaching me all this?" She grabbed my shoulders hard enough to hurt. "Because you need to know. You need to be able to take care of yourself. Promise me you're paying attention. Promise me, I promise you're hurting me." She let go, stepping back and running her hands through her hair. The woman in front of me looked nothing like my composed professional mother. This was someone desperate, frightened, guilty. We spent the rest of the afternoon with her downloading every piece of survival knowledge she'd learnt from Brian directly into my brain. How to build a shelter from branches and leaves, how to set basic snares for small animals, how to navigate by stars, how to signal for help with smoke or mirrors. She even taught me basic first aid, making me practice on her own arms. As the sun began to set, painting the mountains in shades of orange and purple, Mom cooked our dinner over the fire I'd built. She gave me most of her portion, claiming she wasn't hungry. We ate in silence, the only sounds coming from the crackling fire and the distant calls of birds settling for the night. She kept checking her watch, then looking at the darkening sky, then back at me with an expression I can only describe as grief. Finally, as full darkness fell and the temperature began dropping, she stood abruptly. "I forgot the medical kit in the car." "What?" "The car is like 2 miles back through the woods. It's dark. I know exactly where it is. I'll be quick." She was already putting on her jacket and headlamp, her movements sharp and decisive. "Mom, this is crazy. I'll come with you." "No," the word came out almost as a shout. Then softer. "No, honey. Someone needs to stay with our food. There are bears, mountain lions. We can't leave the campsite unprotected. Then let's both go in the morning." She was already backing away from the fire's light. "I'll be right back. 2 hours at most. If you get scared, remember everything I taught you today. You're stronger than you know, Angela." Those words again. The same ones from the night before. "Mum, please don't go. Something feels really wrong about this." She stopped at the edge of the firelight, her face half in shadow, and for a moment I saw my real mother there, the one from before Brian, and her eyes were full of tears. "I love you, Angela, more than you'll ever understand. Never forget that. Whatever happens, never forget that I love you." Then she turned and walked into the darkness between the trees. I heard her footsteps crunching through the undergrowth for a few minutes, getting fainter and fainter, until there was nothing but the sound of the wilderness at night. I maintained the fire exactly as Mum had taught me, adding logs when it got low, banking the coals to preserve heat. The first hour passed with me telling myself she'd be back any moment. Maybe she really had forgotten something important. Maybe she'd gotten turned around in the dark and was being extra careful finding her way back. By the second hour, unease was transforming into fear. The temperature had dropped significantly, and even with the fire, I could see my breath in the air. I called out for her, my voice echoing off the mountains, but only silence answered. Every sound in the darkness became a threat. The snap of a twig meant a bear approaching. The rustle of leaves signaled a mountain lion stalking me. The third hour brought panic. I tried my phone again, walking in circles around the campsite, holding it high above my head, searching desperately for even one bar of signal. Nothing. The no service message mocked me as the battery percentage dropped lower. By the fourth hour, I knew something was terribly wrong. Mum wouldn't leave me alone this long, not unless something had happened to her. Maybe she'd fallen in the dark, broken an ankle, hit her head. Maybe she was lying unconscious somewhere between here and the car, slowly freezing to death, while I sat by the fire doing nothing. I made the decision to search for her. I carefully banked the fire like she'd taught me, grabbed the flashlight, and started marking trees with the hatchet so I could find my way back. The 2-mile hike to where we'd left the car felt like 20. Every shadow could hide danger. Every sound made me freeze in terror. My flashlight beam seemed pathetically small against the vast darkness of the wilderness. When I finally reached the spot where we'd parked, my heart sank into my stomach. The car was gone. Only tire tracks in the dirt proved it had ever been there at all. I stood there in disbelief, shining my flashlight around the empty space, as if the SUV might be hiding behind a tree. That's when I saw the rock. It was placed deliberately where the driver's side door would have been, and underneath was a plastic bag with papers inside. My hands shook as I opened it. There were 2 items. First, the emergency letter Mum had given me, still sealed with wax. Second, a note in Mum's handwriting on a piece of paper torn from a notebook. The first note. The sealed emergency letter read, "Angela, if you're reading this, it means the plan has been carried out. You need to learn to survive on your own. This is not abandonment, it's education. Brian and I will return in 5 days. There are enough supplies if you're smart, and remember what I taught you. This will make you stronger than you ever imagined possible. When we come back, you'll understand why this was necessary. Don't hate me. Everything I do is because I love you. Mom." The second note, clearly written more recently, possibly in the car before she drove away, was shakier, "I'm sorry. Brian says this is the only way. He says you're too soft, too dependent, and if I don't do this, he'll leave. I can't lose him. You're strong enough to handle this. Stronger than I am. 5 days. Just survive 5 days. There's extra food hidden under the large rock near the tent. Please forgive me." I read both notes 3 times before my mind could process what they meant. Then I screamed. I screamed until my throat was raw, until birds exploded from the trees in panic, until my legs gave out and I collapsed in the dirt where our car had been. My mother had abandoned me. On purpose. This wasn't an emergency or an accident. This was planned. She had chosen Brian, a man she'd known for 3 months, over her daughter's safety. She had driven away knowing I was alone in the wilderness, with minimal supplies and no way to call for help. The rage that followed the disbelief gave me enough strength to stand up to stumble back through the darkness to the campsite. I made it back as the first hints of dawn were lightening the eastern sky. My water bottle was nearly empty. The fire had died to cold ashes despite my careful banking. The temperature couldn't have been much above freezing. I searched for the rock she'd mentioned and found a small cache of supplies. 3 freeze-dried meals, 2 energy bars, a bag of trail mix, 1 apple and a half-empty jar of peanut butter. Enough for maybe 3 days if I rationed carefully, not 5. She'd also hidden another note, this one in Brian's handwriting. "Your mother agreed this experience is necessary for your development. Modern comfort has made you weak. These 5 days will strip away the unnecessary and reveal who you really are. Stop being a child. Become a survivor. Prove you're worthy of the time and resources invested in you." I used that note to help restart the fire. The first day alone tested every skill Mum had frantically taught me. Water was the immediate priority. I made my way to the stream purified water using the tablets and filled every container I could find. The purification process took 30 minutes. 30 minutes of sitting alone with the reality of my situation crushing down on me. I inventoried my supplies properly. Besides the food, I had the emergency blanket, the tent, my clothes, basic first aid supplies, matches the knife Brian had given me, and the hatchet. Mum had taken the sleeping bag, the camp stove, most of the food, and of course the car keys and any means of communication. Hunger set in by midday. I ate a quarter of an energy bar, trying to make it last, but my body was burning calories just trying to stay warm. I attempted fishing using a safety pin bent into a hook and dental floss from the first aid kit as line. 4 hours of standing in the freezing stream produced nothing but numb feet and depleted energy. I remembered the berries Mum had shown me and found the bushes, but most were still red, unripe, potentially poisonous. I managed to find maybe 15 purple ones, which did nothing for the gnawing hunger in my stomach. That first night alone was the longest of my life. Without a sleeping bag, I curled up in the emergency blanket inside the tent, but it did little against the cold. Every sound outside sent my heart racing. Around midnight, something large circled the campsite. I could hear it breathing, snuffling occasionally, making low, growling sounds. Bear or mountain lion? I couldn't tell and didn't want to know. I lay frozen in terror, the knife clutched in my hand, trying to remember what Mum had said. Make noise for black bears, play dead for grizzlies, fight back against mountain lions. But in the darkness, paralyzed by fear, all I could do was pray it would go away. After what felt like hours, the sounds moved off into the distance. Day 2 brought a new crisis. Snow. In April, it started as light flurries that quickly became steady snowfall. My tent wasn't designed for winter camping. The temperature plummeted and soon I could see my breath inside the tent. I spent hours gathering firewood, knowing that staying warm was now just as critical as finding food. With shaking hands, I used most of my matches trying to get wet wood to burn. The fire sputtered and smoked, producing more steam than heat. I remembered Mum saying something about pine resin being flammable and spent an hour searching for the sticky substance, finally getting a decent fire going as darkness fell. The hunger was becoming painful. I tried eating pine needle tea and the inner bark of trees like Mum had shown me. The bark was fibrous, bitter, tasted like turpentine, and gave me severe stomach cramps. But it was something in my belly, even if my body rejected it later. Day 3 broke something inside me. I woke to 6 inches of snow and visibility of maybe 20 feet. The world had become a white void. My fire had died overnight despite my efforts to maintain it, and I couldn't feel my fingers as I tried to restart it. When I finally got flames going, I attempted to prepare one of the freeze-dried meals with barely warm water. The result was a crunchy cold mass that I forced down anyway. That's when the hallucinations started. Maybe from hunger, maybe from cold, maybe from the complete isolation. I kept hearing Mum's voice calling my name. Once I was certain, I saw her standing at the edge of the clearing and I ran toward her, only to find nothing but swirling snow. I collapsed there, unable to get up for what might have been minutes or hours. That afternoon, I found another note hidden in the first aid kit wrapped around the bandages. This one was also from Brian. Your mother thinks you're stronger than you show. Prove her right, or prove that I was correct about your weakness. Either way, this experience will reveal the truth. I burned that note too, using it to keep the fire alive another hour. By evening of day 3, I'd eaten my last energy bar. The trail mix was gone. All that remained was a spoonful of peanut butter that I saved like treasure. My lips were cracked and bleeding. My fingers were so swollen from the cold that I couldn't make a proper fist. The snow had turned to sleet, soaking through my jacket, my last defense against hypothermia. I wrote goodbye letters that night, using pages torn from the plant identification book. One to Dad, even though he was gone, telling him I understood now why he'd preferred hotels to camping. One to my best friend Sarah, giving her permission to date my crush since I wouldn't be needing him anymore. One to my grandmother Martha in Florida, apologizing for not visiting more often. And one to Mum that simply said, "You killed me for him." I put the letters in a plastic bag and tucked them inside my jacket, thinking whoever found my body would at least know what had happened. Then I lay in my soaking sleeping bag, listening to the sleet hitting the tent, and waited to die. Day 4 dawned clear and bitter cold. The storm had passed, leaving everything encased in a crystalline layer of ice that would have been breathtaking if I hadn't been dying. I couldn't feel my feet. My hands were so swollen I couldn't grip the tent zipper. It took me 20 minutes to crawl out of the tent, and when I finally did, the world sparkled with a beauty that seemed to mock my suffering. I should have stayed in the tent, conserved what little energy I had left, but something made me stand up. Maybe it was spite. Maybe it was the simple refusal to let Brian win to prove him right about my weakness. Or maybe it was the smoke. At first I thought I was hallucinating again. The thin column of grey against the morning sky seemed too perfect, too convenient. But when I blinked, rubbed my eyes with my swollen hands, it was still there. Smoke meant fire. Fire meant people. People meant rescue. I left everything behind except the whistle around my neck and the plastic bag with my goodbye letters. Each step through the snow was agony. My feet felt like blocks of ice attached to my legs. I fell twice in the first 100 yards the second time, landing hard on my right knee. The pain was sharp enough to cut through the numbness, and I used it as an anchor to reality proof I was still alive. The smoke seemed to get no closer no matter how long I walked. Time became meaningless. I existed in a bubble of cold and pain and determination, one foot in front of the other, following that grey line against the blue sky. I fell more times than I could count. Each time getting back up was harder than the last. Finally, after what might have been hours or days or years, I stumbled into a clearing where an elderly couple was making breakfast outside their well-equipped RV. They had a proper camp stove chairs, a table with a checkered tablecloth. It looked like something from another universe, a world where people camped for pleasure, not survival. The woman saw me first. She dropped her coffee mug, the ceramic shattering against a rock, and ran toward me. Her face went from surprise to horror as she took in my appearance. Later, I would see photos and understand her reaction. I looked like a corpse, walking lips, blue eyes, sunken clothes hanging off my frame. "Oh my God, honey, are you okay? Where are your parents?" I tried to answer, but all that came out was a croak. My throat was too damaged from screaming from dehydration from the cold. The woman wrapped her arms around me just as my legs gave out, and we both went down into the snow. But she held on, cushioning my fall with her own body. "Jim," she called to her husband. Call for help, now the man, Jim, was already moving. Pulling out what I would learn was a satellite phone. I could hear him giving coordinates, his voice urgent but calm. "Yes, she's conscious but barely. Severe dehydration, possible hypothermia, definite frostbite. No, she appears to be alone. We need that helicopter immediately." The woman Beth half carried, half dragged me to their RV. Inside was warm, impossibly warm. She wrapped me in real blankets, thick and soft, and pressed a cup of hot chocolate to my lips. The first sip burned my throat, but it was the most beautiful pain I'd ever felt. "Where are your parents, sweetheart?" Beth asked again, her voice gentle but insistent. "What happened to you?" My voice came out as barely a whisper. "My mum left me. On purpose. With her boyfriend." The look that passed between Beth and Jim told me they didn't quite believe me. Who would believe a mother would deliberately abandon her child in the wilderness? But Beth just stroked my matted hair and kept giving me small sips of chocolate. "How long have you been alone?" Jim asked, kneeling beside me with the satellite phone still in his hand. 4 days. They said 5. Coming back tomorrow. Jim's expression darkened. He stood up and walked to the other side of the RV, but I could still hear him updating whoever was on the phone. The new information changed everything in his voice. Possible child endangerment situation. Yes, she says it was deliberate. 4 days alone. Parents supposedly returning tomorrow. Beth held my hands, trying to warm them between hers. Her eyes filled with tears when she saw my fingernails dark with frostbite. "We saw a couple at the Mountain View Lodge 3 days ago," she said slowly, like she was solving a puzzle. The woman was blonde, looked nervous. She was with a man, very controlling type, military bearing. My heart, which had been barely beating, suddenly raced. "That's them, Mum and Brian. Were they okay? Did they look okay?" Jim had come back to my side. They were having champagne on the deck. The man made a toast about building character and making tough choices. The woman looked like she'd been crying, but she was laughing at his jokes. The rage that flooded through me was hot enough to melt all the snow in Colorado. They were celebrating. While I was dying, freezing, starving, they were drinking champagne at a luxury lodge. The betrayal was complete, absolute, unforgivable. The Rangers arrived 20 minutes later in a convoy of vehicles, lights flashing, sirens echoing off the mountains. The lead ranger officer, Patricia Chen, took one look at me and immediately called for medical backup. They started an IV in my arm right there in the RV, while Officer Chen asked careful professional questions about exactly what had happened. When I showed her Mom's notes, the ones I'd kept in the plastic bag with my goodbye letters, her expression went from concerned to furious in seconds. She stepped outside to make phone calls, and I heard fragments that made Beth hold me tighter. Child endangerment, criminal conspiracy, immediate warrant, check the lodge. The medical team wanted to evacuate me by helicopter, but the weather was still too unstable from the storm. Instead, they loaded me into a specially equipped vehicle, Officer Chen riding with me. She asked for my emergency contacts, and when I mentioned my grandmother in Florida, she immediately got her number from me. Your grandmother is being notified right now. She'll be on the next flight out, Officer Chen assured me. We're also going to find your mother and Brian. They won't get away with this. At the Ranger Station Medical Facility, the doctor, an older man with kind eyes, documented every injury with photographs. My frostbitten fingers and toes, the severe dehydration evident in my sunken eyes and cracked lips, the weight loss visible even after just 4 days, the scratches and bruises from falls. Evidence, he said quietly when he saw me watching. This is all evidence. Officer Chen returned 2 hours later with news that made my blood run cold and hot at the same time. We've located your mother and Brian. They never left the area. They've been staying at the Mountain View Lodge approximately 10 miles from where you were camping. The same place Beth and Jim saw them. They were there the whole time. My voice broke. 10 miles away, Officer Chen sat down beside my bed, her expression grim but sympathetic. Angela, I need to tell you something else we've discovered. Brian Anderson has been involved in similar incidents before. We found 3 separate complaints over the past 5 years. Parents who say he convinced them to subject their children to extreme survival situations. He's done this before, I said, not really surprised. Of course he had. The way he'd talked about weakness, about building character, it all made sense now. 2 complaints from his ex-wife about what he did to their children, one from another woman he dated briefly. None resulted in criminal charges because the children were eventually retrieved and the parents claimed it was consensual wilderness therapy. But I didn't consent. Mum didn't even tell me. No, you didn't. And that's why this time is different. That's why we're going to make sure both of them face consequences. They brought Mum and Brian in for questioning that evening. I watched through a window as they arrived. Mum wore designer workout clothes and looked perfectly put together, not a hair out of place. Brian was in expensive outdoor gear, looking annoyed rather than concerned. They were holding hands until they saw the police vehicles. Then Mum's face went white, and she jerked her hand away from Brian's. They put them in separate interview rooms. Officer Chen asked if I wanted to observe while they questioned Mum. Part of me wanted to hide from the truth, but a bigger part needed to hear her try to explain this. Mum started crying the moment Officer Chen began recording. It wasn't supposed to be like this, she said, her perfectly applied makeup running in black streams down her cheeks. We were monitoring her. Brian had GPS trackers. He knew exactly where she was. Officer Chen's voice was ice cold. You left a 16-year-old child alone in the wilderness during a snowstorm with minimal supplies. What exactly was it supposed to be like? Brian said modern kids are too soft, too coddled. He said Angela was too dependent on me, that she'd never survive in the real world without learning to be self-sufficient. He said 5 days would teach her more than 16 years of comfortable living. Did he threaten you? Force you to do this? Mum was quiet for so long, I thought she wouldn't answer. Then in a whisper, he said if I didn't agree, if I didn't prove I was strong enough to make hard decisions about Angela's development, he'd leave me. He said I was enabling her weakness by protecting her too much. So you chose keeping him over your daughter's safety. The silence stretched until Mum finally whispered, I chose wrong. They questioned Brian next, and his story was completely different. He claimed it was all Mum's idea, that she'd begged him to help make me stronger. He presented himself as a professional trainer who'd simply given advice that was taken too far. He actually smiled at one point, saying I'd proven his point by surviving, showing that his methods worked. Officer Chen destroyed his narrative with facts. The notes in his handwriting, the GPS tracker registered to his company, the testimony from Beth and Jim about him celebrating at the lodge, the pattern of behavior from previous incidents. By the end, Brian had stopped smiling and demanded a lawyer. My grandmother Martha arrived the next morning on a red-eye flight from Florida. I hadn't seen her in 2 years, our relationship reduced to birthday cards and Christmas calls, because Mum always had excuses for why we couldn't visit. The moment she walked into my hospital room, she took one look at me and burst into tears. My baby girl, she kept saying, holding me as gently as if I might break. What did she do to you? Grandma Martha was nothing like Mum. Where Mum was polished and controlled, Martha was warm and real. She wore a flowered dress that smelled like vanilla and lavender, and her hands were soft but strong as she held mine. She'd raised Mum alone after my grandfather died when Mum was 10, and I could see the guilt in her eyes, like she was somehow responsible for what her daughter had become. The lawyer she'd hired arrived within hours. A sharp woman named Patricia Gonzalez, who specialized in family law and criminal cases. She took my complete statement, recording everything, asking detailed questions that made me relive every moment of those 4 days. When I finished, she promised me 2 things. First, I would never have to go back to Mom. Second, both Mom and Brian would face the maximum possible consequences. The media found out about the story within 24 hours. Teen abandoned in mountains by mother became national news. Reporters camped outside the ranger station trying to get photos, requesting interviews. Patricia Gonzalez handled them all with icy professionalism, giving them just enough information to keep the pressure on the authorities while protecting my privacy. The other families Brian had hurt started coming forward. His ex-wife Sandra flew in from Texas with their 2 children, now adults. His son Michael, 23, testified about being left in the desert for 2 days when he was 14. His daughter Jessica, 21, described being forced to swim across a lake in near-freezing water to prove she wasn't weak. Both had needed years of therapy, and neither had spoken to their father since the divorce. The woman Brian had dated after his divorce, Helen, shared her story about him convincing her to leave her 12-year-old son in the woods overnight. She'd refused at the last minute, and Brian had ended their relationship immediately, calling her weak and pathetic. She'd been too embarrassed to report it at the time. The prosecutor built a powerful case. Child endangerment conspiracy to commit child abuse, reckless endangerment, and because they'd crossed state lines to get to the campsite, federal charges were possible. Mum's lawyer tried to argue she was a victim too manipulated by a controlling partner, but the prosecutor had those texts between Mom and Brian, planning everything, discussing the GPS tracker, agreeing on the 5-day timeline. Most damaging was a video Brian had made Mum record before they left for the lodge. In it, she stated clearly that she was choosing to leave me for a predetermined period as part of a wilderness training experience. She looked directly at the camera and said she understood the risks and accepted them. Brian had kept it as insurance, probably to protect himself if something went wrong. Instead, it became the key piece of evidence against both of them. During the week between my rescue and the preliminary hearing, I stayed with Martha in a hotel near the hospital. She never left my side except to get food or handle legal matters. At night, when the nightmares came, and they came every night, she would sit on my bed and sing the same lullabies she'd sung to Mum as a baby. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. I had to testify at the preliminary hearing. Patricia Gonzalez prepared me carefully, but nothing could have prepared me for seeing Mum in an orange jumpsuit, her hands cuffed in front of her. She'd lost weight, her hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and without makeup, she looked older, smaller, defeated. When I took the stand, she tried to make eye contact, mouthing, "I'm sorry," over and over. I looked straight through her, focusing on a spot on the back wall as I described those 4 days in detail. The hunger, the cold, the fear, the certainty that I was going to die. I showed the court my frostbitten fingers still wrapped in bandages. I read the notes she and Brian had left, my voice steady, even as people in the gallery gasped. Brian's lawyer tried to challenge my testimony, suggesting I was exaggerating, that I'd been in no real danger. But the medical records spoke for themselves. The doctor testified that another day, maybe 2, and I would have died from exposure. The temperature records showed it had dropped to 22 degrees Fahrenheit during the storm. The photos of my condition when found were entered into evidence, causing several people to leave the courtroom. The judge denied bail for Brian, considering him a flight risk and a danger to children. Mum was released on a $200,000 bond with conditions. She couldn't leave the state, couldn't contact me, and had to surrender her passport. As court officers led Brian away, he turned to look at me with such hatred that the bailiff stepped between us. Outside the courthouse, Mum broke away from her lawyer and approached us, stopping just outside the 50-foot distance required by the restraining order. "Angela, please. Let me explain. I never wanted you to get hurt. I thought it would make you stronger." Martha stepped forward, something fierce in her eyes. "You thought abandoning her in the mountains would make her stronger? What is wrong with you, Jennifer? What happened to my daughter Brian happened," Mum screamed. "He got in my head. He made me believe things. He said if I didn't do this, I'd lose him and I couldn't be alone again. So you chose a man you'd known for 3 months over the daughter you'd raised for 16 years. Martha's voice was deadly quiet. I finally spoke, my voice carrying across the distance between us. "You didn't just choose him, Mom. You chose to risk my life for him. You celebrated with champagne while I was dying. There's no explanation that makes that okay." Her face crumpled, but I felt nothing. No sympathy, no sadness, just a hollow space where my love for her used to be. Martha led me away, and that was the last time I saw my mother for over a year. The transition to life in Florida with Martha was both easier and harder than I expected. Easier because Martha's house in St. Petersburg was warm and bright and safe, with a pool in the backyard and a bedroom she'd immediately redecorated just for me. Harder because the trauma didn't stay in Colorado just because I'd left. The nightmares were relentless. Every night I was back in that tent, snow falling, unable to light a fire, certain I was going to die. I'd wake up screaming, drenched in sweat, and find Martha already there, turning on all the lights, reminding me where I was. "You're safe," she'd say, over and over. "You're in Florida. It's 70 degrees outside. You survived." She found me a therapist, Dr. Williams, who specialized in trauma from family betrayal. Twice a week, I sat in his office with its ocean paintings and soft lighting, trying to make sense of how my mother had become someone capable of abandoning me. Betrayal trauma from a parent is particularly devastating, Dr. Williams explained during our third session. Our brains are wired to trust our caregivers completely. When that trust is broken so fundamentally, it affects every aspect of how we see the world and relationships. The PTSD diagnosis came with a list of symptoms I was already living. Hypervigilance, where every unexpected sound made me jump. Panic attacks triggered by cold weather or being alone. An inability to trust anyone's intentions. Night terrors that left me exhausted. An eating disorder developing because my body remembered starvation and wanted to hoard food. Starting school in St. Petersburg was surreal. Word had somehow spread about my story, probably through social media and news coverage. On my first day, a girl in my English class said, "You're the girl whose mum left her to die in the mountains." "Yes," I replied, too tired to pretend otherwise. "That's completely insane. I'm so sorry that happened to you." Some students treated me with kid gloves like I might shatter at any moment. Others stared at me with morbid curiosity like I was a character from a true crime documentary. A few avoided me entirely as if trauma might be contagious. But there were also unexpected allies. Jake found me during lunch on my third day, sitting alone in the courtyard. He didn't introduce himself, just sat down and said, "My dad left me in the Mojave Desert for 2 days when I was 13. Said it would make me a man." I looked at him, really looked at him. He had the same haunted eyes I saw in the mirror every morning. "You survived. Barely. Had to be airlifted out." He showed me scars on his arms from cactus spines and sun poisoning. Dad went to prison for a year. Mum divorced him. Haven't seen him since. We became inseparable after that. Not romantic, but something deeper. We understood each other's triggers without explanation. When the air conditioning made me too cold, he'd notice before I started panicking. When certain survival shows came on TV in the common area, we'd both leave without a word. We started a support group for teens who'd survived parental abuse, meeting weekly in the school counselor's office. 6 months into my new life, a letter arrived from Mum in prison. Martha asked if I wanted to read it, and curiosity won over anger. It was 10 pages of excuses dressed up as apologies. She wrote about Brian's manipulation tactics, how he'd isolated her from friends, made her financially dependent on him, by convincing her to invest in his business, threatened to destroy her reputation if she didn't comply with his vision for raising me. "I don't expect forgiveness," she wrote, "but I need you to know that I was a victim too. Brian is a master manipulator. He knew exactly how to exploit my fears of being alone, my insecurities about being a good mother. He convinced me that loving you meant making you stronger through suffering." I read the whole thing once, then burned it in Martha's backyard fire pit. Being manipulated didn't excuse her choices. Plenty of people get involved with controlling partners without abandoning their children to die. She'd made a choice, and that choice had nearly killed me. The trial was scheduled for 14 months after my rescue. During that time, Brian had tried every legal maneuver possible to get the charges dropped or reduced. His lawyer argued it was wilderness therapy gone wrong due to unexpected weather. The prosecutor countered with meteorological data showing the storm had been predicted days in advance, and the GPS data showing Brian and Mom had driven directly to the lodge after abandoning me. More victims came forward as news coverage continued. A family from Oregon, whose son Brian had convinced them to leave in the woods for a week. A single father from Arizona who'd hired Brian's company and ended up with his daughter hospitalized from dehydration. Each story was slightly different, but the pattern was clear. Brian targeted single parents or troubled couples, convinced them their children were weak, and orchestrated dangerous abandonment scenarios disguised as character building. During this time, Martha's health began declining. The stress of everything was taking its toll on her 72-year-old body. She developed heart problems, high blood pressure, needed medication that made her tired, but she never complained, never suggested this was too much for her. She'd failed to protect me from her daughter, she said once, and she'd spend whatever time she had left making sure I was safe. One evening, about 10 months after my rescue, Martha sat me down with a box of old photos and documents. "I want to show you something," she said. "I should have recognized the signs in Jennifer earlier. Should have gotten her help." The photos showed Mum's childhood, but also her teenage years and early 20s. In almost every photo from after age 15, she was with a different boyfriend. Martha pointed out patterns I hadn't noticed. Mum always changed herself for whoever she was dating. With the musician boyfriend, she'd dyed her hair black and pierced her nose. With the law student, she'd dressed preppy and joined debate clubs. With the athlete, she'd taken up running and became vegetarian. She never knew who she was without a man defining her, Martha explained. "When your father died, I thought she'd finally found herself focusing on you and her career. But she was just waiting for the next man to tell her who to be. Brian was the worst because he told her to be someone who would sacrifice her own child." We discovered more disturbing information as the trial approached. Mum had taken out a large life insurance policy on me, just 2 weeks before the camping trip with Brian, listed as the secondary beneficiary after her. The prosecutor added attempted murder charges based on this evidence, though they'd be harder to prove than the child endangerment charges. Brian's past also came to light in greater detail. His military discharge hadn't been honourable as he'd claimed. He'd been discharged for psychological reasons after incidents involving unnecessary endangerment of soldiers under his command during training exercises. He'd been married twice, before both marriages ending with restraining orders. His own parents testified that he'd been cruel to animals as a child, a classic warning sign of antisocial personality disorder. The trial lasted 3 weeks. I had to testify for 5 hours over 2 days, describing every detail of those 4 days in the mountains. The defense tried to break me, suggesting I was exaggerating, that I'd had adequate supplies, that the danger was manufactured for sympathy. But I had the medical records, the photographs, the frostbite scars that would never fully fade. Other witnesses testified to seeing Mom and Brian at the lodge celebrating while I was dying. The champagne receipt was entered into evidence showing they'd bought a $300 bottle. The GPS data showed they'd checked my location only twice during the 5 days both times from the comfort of the lodge's hot tub. Mom testified in her own defense, crying through most of it. She painted herself as a victim of Brian's coercive control, claiming she'd wanted to go back for me after the first night, but Brian had physically prevented her. But under cross-examination, she admitted she'd had opportunities to call for help, to tell someone at the lodge, to drive back alone while Brian slept. She'd chosen not to. Brian testified with the same arrogance he'd always shown. He claimed his methods were based on ancient tribal initiations, that modern society had forgotten the importance of real challenges. He actually said I should be grateful for the experience, that it had made me stronger than I ever would have been otherwise. Several jury members visibly recoiled at that statement. The verdict came back after just 4 hours of deliberation. Brian was found guilty on all counts. 8 years in federal prison, 10 years probation after release, lifetime ban on working with children, and required registration as a child abuser. When the verdict was read, he showed no emotion, just stared at me with those cold eyes. Mum was found guilty of child endangerment and conspiracy, but not attempted murder. 2 years in prison, 5 years probation, mandatory psychiatric treatment, and permanent loss of parental rights. When her verdict was read, she collapsed, sobbing so hard the bailiffs had to carry her out. As we left the courthouse, media everywhere, Martha held my hand tight. She was so frail by then, but she stood straight and proud. A reporter asked how I felt about the verdicts. I thought about all the rehearsed statements Patricia Gonzalez had prepared, but instead I said simply, they got what they deserved. My grandmother and I are going home now, but home wasn't going to be with Martha much longer. 2 weeks after the trial, she had a massive heart attack. I found her in her garden, collapsed among the tomato plants she loved. The ambulance came quickly, but the damage was done. She lived 3 more days long enough to make sure all her affairs were in order, that I would be taken care of. Her last words to me were, "You survived them, Angela. Now go live." After Martha's death, I could have been placed in foster care for the remaining 8 months until my 18th birthday, but Patricia Gonzalez fought for me to be declared an emancipated minor. Given everything I'd survived and the inheritance Martha had left me, including her house and a trust fund she'd set up, the court agreed. I finished high school in Florida, graduating with honors, despite everything. The guidance counselor said it was remarkable given what I'd been through, but I think the trauma had taught me to compartmentalize, to focus on what I could control when everything else felt chaotic. My college essays about survival, both literal and metaphorical, got me accepted everywhere I applied. I chose the University of Colorado Boulder. Everyone thought I was crazy going back to the state where it all happened, but I needed to reclaim those mountains on my terms. I majored in psychology with a minor in recreation therapy, determined to understand what had happened to me and help others who'd experienced similar trauma. During my sophomore year, I started volunteering with a legitimate wilderness therapy program, one with strict safety protocols and ethical guidelines. That's where I met David, a graduate student, studying the difference between therapeutic challenge and traumatic experience. He was leading a training session on recognizing signs of abuse, disguised as tough love parenting. Our first conversation was about the ethics of controlled adversity. He argued that real growth came from supported challenges, not abandonment. I told him about my experience, and instead of the usual shock or pity, he simply asked, "What would have been a healthy way to teach you those survival skills?" We spent hours discussing it over coffee, then dinner, then long walks around campus. David had his own history with an abusive stepfather who used military-style discipline as cover for cruelty. He understood the complexity of trauma the way it shaped, but didn't have to define you. Our relationship developed slowly, carefully. Trust was hard for me, maybe impossible, but David never pushed. He understood when I needed to sleep with lights on, when I couldn't handle camping trips, even in safe circumstances, when I had to check in constantly, so he knew I hadn't been abandoned. He gave me his location constantly, without being asked, understanding my need to know people weren't secretly leaving. I started leading support groups for survivors of parental abuse and abandonment. The stories were all different but the same. Parents who chose addiction over children. Parents who chose new partners over their kids' safety. Parents who believed in brutal discipline disguised as character building. We called ourselves the Abandoned Ones, and we met weekly to remind each other we weren't alone. Brian wrote to me from prison during my junior year. The letter was forwarded through my lawyer since he wasn't supposed to contact me directly. It was a non-apology full of justifications and accusations. He claimed I'd become successful because of what he'd put me through, that my survival story had given me opportunities I never would have had otherwise. He wanted acknowledgement that his methods, however harsh, had worked. I didn't respond, but I kept the letter as a reminder of how abusers think. They reframe their abuse as help, their cruelty as love, their victim's survival as proof the abuse was justified. It became part of my senior thesis on the psychology of parental abandonment and the narratives abusers create to justify their actions. Mum was released after 18 months early for good behaviour. She moved to Oregon, started working at a non-profit for women escaping abusive relationships. The irony wasn't lost on me. She sent letters through my lawyer every few months, updates on her therapy progress, her work helping other women recognise controlling partners, her deep regret for choosing Brian over me. 3 years after her release, she sent a different kind of letter. She was getting married again to a man named Robert she'd met at her therapy group. She wanted me to know, but wasn't inviting me to the wedding, respecting my boundaries. She included a photo of them together, and I could see she'd found another man to define herself through just wearing a different costume this time. David and I got married the summer after I graduated, a small ceremony in Florida near Martha's grave. Jake was my man of honor, and the other abandoned ones were my wedding party. We wrote our own vows, and mine included a promise to never sacrifice our future children for anyone or anything, to protect them while teaching them strength through love, not suffering. We moved to Denver, where I started a non-profit called True North Wilderness Therapy. We taught actual survival skills with comprehensive safety measures. Multiple instructors, GPS beacons for everyone, satellite phones, clear communication with parents who had to participate in parts of the program. We specialized in helping at-risk youth, but we did it right. No one was ever alone, ever abandoned, ever put in real danger. The program grew quickly. Other families who'd been hurt by people like Brian came forward wanting to support an ethical alternative. We developed certification standards for wilderness therapy programs, lobbying for state regulations requiring background checks, safety protocols, and prohibited abandonment practices. Brian was released after 6 years early for good behavior, despite violating prison rules multiple times. He immediately tried to start a new program in Wyoming, calling it Forge Through Fire. When I found out, I contacted every media outlet, every parent group, every youth organization in Wyoming. The program never launched. He tried again in Montana, then Idaho. Each time survivors and advocates shut him down. He showed up at my office one day 7 years after the mountains. Security stopped him at the entrance, but I watched him on the cameras, older, thinner, but with the same cold eyes. He stood there for an hour just staring at the building before police arrived and reminded him about the lifetime restraining order. I found out later he'd been living in his car, unable to hold jobs once employers Googled his name. Part of me felt satisfaction at his suffering. Another part recognized how broken he must have always been to think abandoning children would make them strong. But I felt no sympathy. Some people deserve their consequences. At 31, I have my own daughter Emma, named after the girl who would have been my stepsister if Mum had chosen differently. She's 3 now, curious and brave and protected. David and I teach her real skills, age-appropriate challenges, independence through scaffolded support. She knows she can always count on us, that love means presence, not abandonment. Sometimes Emma asks about her other grandma, since David's parents are very involved. I tell her the truth in simple terms. My mummy made bad choices and isn't safe to be around. When she's older, I'll tell her more. Use it as a teaching moment about recognizing manipulation, choosing partners wisely, never sacrificing children for anyone. Mum still sends letters twice a year on my birthday and the anniversary of my rescue. I don't read them anymore, just file them away. Maybe someday Emma will want to know about her, or maybe not. That will be her choice, made with full information and support the way choices should be made. The mountains that nearly killed me are visible from my office window. Sometimes I look at them and remember the terrified 16-year-old girl who thought she was going to die alone in the snow. But mostly I see them as what they are: beautiful, dangerous, indifferent. They didn't try to kill me. My mother did that. The mountains just witnessed it. Looking back now at 31 with years of therapy, education and healing behind me, I can see the complete picture of what happened in those mountains. It wasn't just about survival. It was about the fundamental breaking of the sacred trust between parent and child, the moment when someone who should protect you instead offers you up as a sacrifice to keep someone else interested. True strength isn't built through betrayal and abandonment. It doesn't come from suffering or trauma or near-death experiences. Real strength comes from the choice to keep living after someone breaks you, to rebuild yourself without becoming like them, to break cycles instead of perpetuating them. My mother thought leaving me to potentially die would make me strong. Brian thought suffering would strip away weakness and reveal character. They were both wrong. What made me strong was surviving their betrayal and choosing to become someone who protects rather than abandons, who builds up rather than tears down, who sees vulnerability as human rather than weakness. The 4 days in the mountains were just the beginning. The real survival came after, in the courtrooms, where I had to face them in the therapy sessions, where I had to relive it in the quiet moments, when I had to choose whether to become bitter or better. It came in learning to trust David, despite every cell in my body screaming that trust equals danger. It came in becoming a mother myself and feeling the fierce protectiveness that made my own mother's betrayal even more incomprehensible. I've met hundreds of survivors through my work now. Each story is unique, but the patterns are the same. A parent who chooses something or someone over their child's well-being. A child who blames themselves wonders what they did wrong, what they could have done differently. The slow realization that it was never about them, that they were just collateral damage in someone else's dysfunction. The life insurance policy my mother took out on me before the trip haunts me more than the abandonment itself sometimes. It suggests a level of premeditation that goes beyond being manipulated by Brian. It suggests she knew I might die and wanted to profit from it. She claims Brian made her do it, that it was meant to be just a precaution that made the whole thing look more legitimate. But she signed those papers. She named him as a beneficiary. She put a monetary value on my death. That's the thing about betrayal trauma from a parent. It's not just the single act of abandonment. It's all the tiny betrayals you discover later, all the lies that come to light, all the moments you reframe with new understanding. Every happy memory becomes tainted with the knowledge of what they were capable of. Every photo of us together from before carries the shadow of after. But here's what I've learned. Their betrayal doesn't define my worth. Their abandonment doesn't determine my value. Their choice to sacrifice me for their own needs says everything about them and nothing about me. I deserved protection and got abandonment. I deserved love and got betrayal. I deserved better, and when I didn't get it from them, I built it for myself. My life now is everything they tried to take from me. I have a career helping others heal from similar trauma. I have a marriage built on real trust earned slowly and maintained carefully. I have a daughter who will never question whether I would choose her over anyone or anything. I have friends who became family bonds forged in shared understanding rather than blood. The scars from frostbite on my fingers still ache when it's cold. I still can't camp even in controlled circumstances. I still have nightmares sometimes waking up convinced I'm back in that tent. These are permanent marks, reminders of what surviving really costs, but they're also proof of what I overcame. Brian is out there somewhere, probably still convinced he was right, that suffering builds character, that abandonment creates strength. Mum is in Oregon with her new husband, probably still defining herself through whatever man is currently in her life. Neither of them can hurt me anymore. Their power over me ended when I chose to survive, not just those 4 days, but every day after. To anyone watching who has their own mountains, literal or metaphorical, who was abandoned by someone who should have protected them, I want you to know something. You didn't deserve it. It wasn't your fault. Their failure to protect you was about their brokenness, not your worth. You survived something that should have destroyed you and that makes you extraordinary. But you don't have to be grateful for the trauma. You don't have to thank them for making you stronger. You don't have to forgive to heal. You can acknowledge that you became strong despite them, not because of them. You can honor your survival while still condemning what you had to survive. The mountains didn't make me who I am. The abandonment didn't build my character. What shaped me was the choice to keep going when everything in me wanted to give up. What defined me was deciding to become someone who helps rather than harms, who protects rather than abandons, who shows others that survival is possible and life after betrayal can be beautiful. My mother took me camping when I was 16 and left me alone in the mountains. She thought it would make me stronger. She was wrong. It nearly killed me. But I survived, and in surviving, I learnt the most important lesson of my life. Family isn't about blood or obligation or the people who are supposed to love you. Family is about the people who show up when you're freezing and starving and afraid. It's about the people who choose you again and again, especially when choosing you is hard. Thank you for listening to my story. If you've survived abandonment, betrayal, or abuse from someone who should have protected you, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. What helped you heal? How did you learn to trust again? How do you protect your own children from the cycles you survived? Please like this video if it resonated with you and subscribe for more stories of survival and healing. Share this with someone who needs to hear that survival is possible, that betrayal doesn't define them, that they deserve better than what they got. Remember, you don't have to be grateful for trauma that made you strong. You can be proud of surviving while still acknowledging that you shouldn't have had to. Stay safe. Trust wisely and know that choosing yourself after someone else didn't is the ultimate act of strength.